Hello everybody. In this video we'll take a first look at Autodesk Mudbox. And the first thing I'm going to do is go to File, New Scene. And a welcome screen will pop up. Let's take a look at what's in this welcome screen. When you first start learning Mudbox, this is very useful. We've got the Learn Mudbox 1-minute videos. I highly recommend watching these. For instance, as you first get started, navigating the view using a mouse will be very useful, as well as this video where you will start sculpting. In addition, there's also a link to a quick start tutorial, and we have a bunch of meshes that we can use as a starting point for our sculpting. I am going to drag down and select the T-Rex. The first thing we'll look at is how to navigate in 3D space in Mudbox. And if you're already familiar with Maya, this is going to come very easily for you because you navigate in 3D space the same way in Mudbox. So for example, if I hold down the Alt key on my keyboard and I use the left mouse button, I can rotate my camera. Notice that the mesh is actually staying stationary. It is the camera that I am rotating. If I hold down the Alt button and the middle mouse button on my mouse, I can pan. And if I hold down the Alt button and the right mouse button, I can zoom in and out. In addition, I can also use the wheel on my mouse to zoom in and out. In addition, there are a couple hotkeys that are useful for navigating in 3D space. So I'm going to use my Alt mouse button and the Alt key and then the right mouse button to zoom out. And if I press A on my keyboard, it will focus on my scene. And if I press F on my keyboard and, for instance, place, let's say, the mouse on the right top claw here, it'll focus on where my mouse is. Let me zoom out again using the A key on my keyboard, and I'll focus at the end of the tail. So I'll put my mouse at the end of the tail and press the F key. I'll zoom back out with the A key, and let's take a look at the T-Rex's snout. Once again, I'll put my mouse where I want to focus and press the F key. This is a very convenient technique for navigating in your 3D space. Something else I'd like to bring your attention to is this area here on the user interface, the right side of the user interface. Currently, I'm in layers, and we have two different kinds of layers. We have sculpt layers and paint layers. We'll be primarily working in the sculpt layer in this lesson, and in a later video I'll cover painting. But what I want to draw your attention to now is the object list. So I'm going to select that tab instead. And here we can see another representation of our scene. This is very similar to Maya's outliner. So what you'll notice is that in this scene, nested underneath it, we have a perspective camera, a top camera, side and front camera. We have a standard light, a directional light, and a default material that is applied to all our meshes initially. And finally, we have our T-Rex here, the T-Rex that is in our scene. I'd also like to bring your attention to the display here. If I go to display, you'll notice that there's wireframe, which is activated right now. You also notice that there is a hotkey for it, the W key. If I turn off wireframe, we'll no longer see the wireframe on our mesh, and I can turn it back on using the W key. In fact, the W key is a toggle, so I can turn it on and turn it off. Sometimes having wireframe on is going to be very useful for you as you're sculpting. In your user interface, you also find your tools down here at the bottom. Currently, we're in the Sculpt tools, which is what we'll start looking at today. However, you can see that there's also a tab for Paint tools, Curve tools, Pose tools, and Select Move tools. To demonstrate the Sculpt tools, I'm going to start a new scene. And remember that to do that, you just go to File, New Scene. I'm not going to save this. And to demonstrate the Sculpt tool, I'm going to start with a plane. To start using my Sculpt tool, I simply select it. And what I want you to notice here is that anytime you put your mouse on a tool and you leave it there, you will actually get a description of what the tool does. In this case, we're looking at the Sculpt tool, and the instructions here tell us that the Sculpt tool lifts the surface as you stroke over it. So let's give it a try. And here's what we have. Now, one thing I would like to point out here is that the Sculpt tool currently, as I'm painting on this mesh doesn't really have enough geometry, high enough resolution to really work with it effectively. So what we need to do is add more resolution to this mesh, and if we add more resolution to it, we'll get a smoother result. So here's how we can add more resolution. I'm going to navigate to Mesh, Add New Subdivision Level. Notice that there's also a hotkey combination for this, and it is Shift+D. So if I select Add New Subdivision Level, you'll notice that now I have a level 3 with a polygon count of 6,400. And already we're getting a much smoother result. Remember that the hotkey combination to do that same action is Shift+D, which I'm going to do now. Shift+D, and now I have a level 4 of 25,600 polygons. Let me do it yet one more time for level 5 of 102,400 polygons. This is one of the strengths of Mudbox, is that we're able to work with a very high resolution mesh, which gives us nice smooth results. You're able to work with a lot more, much higher polygon count than you can in a program like Maya. Let's take a look once again here in our object list. This is our plane, and you'll notice that there is a plus icon next to it. If I expand that, I'll see all my different levels that I have for this mesh. So even though we've upped the resolution, we're still able to work with this polygon plane at any one of these different levels. Now, the way I can go back down to some of these lower levels is to go to Mesh, Step Level Down. Notice that we have a hotkey combination for that, and it is Page Down on your keyboard. And Step Level Up is Page Up. So I'm going to do a Page Down, and you'll notice that we're now back to our level 4. If I use my page down key on my keyboard, I can go back to level 3, level 2, level 1. I can even go to level 0 where we only have 100 faces. If I wish to return to my higher resolution meshes, I'll simply use the page up button on my keyboard, and I can cycle through any of these different levels. Now, in this video, we're only going to go over a few of the tools. We're only going to go over Sculpt, Smooth, and Erase. Let's see what happens when we select the Erase tool. I want to erase these effects that the sculpting that I did on this polygon plane. Now remember, as I said earlier, if you hold your mouse over a tool, it will tell you what the tool does. So I'm going to hold my mouse over the erase tool, and you'll see that it says that the sculpt erase applies to sculpt layers only. The sculpt erase tool erases the sculpting in the current sculpt layer. Problem is, I am not working in layers right now. So if I select this erase tool, you'll notice I get this message telling me that I don't have any sculpt layers, and therefore I cannot erase. When you're working in Mudbox, I strongly recommend you use layers. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to select this plane, and I'm going to delete it and just start a new sculpt. So I'll delete that, and instead of starting a new scene, this time I'll just go to Create Mesh. You'll notice I have all the same options for starting meshes, and I will create another plane, a brand new plane. Okay, so if I want to work in layers, I'm going to return to my Layers tab here, and I'm going to create a layer. And it's called Sculpt Layer 1. And I'm going to start sculpting on this mesh. I'll select my Sculpt tool and start sculpting. Now, you'll remember that I was saying earlier you'll need to have a higher resolution mesh. Generally, you'll get better results. So I'm going to increase the resolution of my mesh by using Shift+D. And I'm going to create 6 levels. I'll go to level 6 where I have 409,600 faces. Now remember that you can page up and page down at these different levels, and you can work in any of these levels as you're sculpting. This is very convenient. Sometimes you're going to want to work on your mesh at a lower resolution because the program will be more responsive, it'll work more quickly. Other times when you're putting in fine details, you'll want to work at one of these higher levels like level 6. Notice, however, that I can't paint, or I can't sculpt rather, on this mesh now. Remember, I'm working in layers, and in fact you'll see that this layer, the layer that I originally created, has this icon indicating that I cannot sculpt. I cannot sculpt on it. Layers are dependent on the level that you're currently working on. So if I do page down, and I return, in this case to level 2, you'll see that once again I can sculpt. If I go to level 6, I go to level 6, I cannot. However, if I create a new layer, I can now sculpt on that layer. A couple other features that are convenient and useful when working with layers is that you can hide and unhide them. You can also change the strength of them using a slider. We'll now start looking at the different tool settings. With my Sculpt tool selected, I'm going to hide these 2 layers, and I'm going to create a new layer. And I will just create this stroke here. I'm going to press the W key to hide the wireframe on it. And here's the stroke that I created. Now, what if I want to change the size of my brush or the strength of my brush? Well, with this tool selected, what I can do is adjust both size and strength here on the right side. So in the case of size, currently I have it set to 14.22. I'm going to make the brush smaller. We'll try that out. I'll also make it larger. In addition, I'm going to bring the size back down. In addition, we can change the strength of it. So let's see what that'll look like. Currently, here's what my brush looks like. If I decrease the strength of it, I'll have a more subtle sculpt. If I increase the strength of it, the sculpt will be, it'll have a stronger effect. Now there is a more intuitive way to change the size and strength of your brush, and once again, if you're familiar with brushes in Maya, you'll already know how to do this in Mudbox as well. Let me hide this layer and create a new layer to demonstrate. So remember that you can change the size and strength of your brush here when you have it selected. You can change the size and strength here on the right hand side. This is what my brush looks like now. Let's say that I want to adjust the size of my brush. I can hold down the B key on my keyboard and use the left mouse button to interactively adjust the size of the brush. In addition, I can also change the strength of it by holding down the M key. Holding down the M key, and notice that if I use my left mouse button, I can bring down the strength or increase the strength very easily, very intuitively. Now, you'll remember earlier I was trying to use the erase tool and it wasn't working because I wasn't using a layer. I didn't have any layers. Let's try it now that I have these layers. Let's see what happens if I use the erase tool. And this particular brush stroke here, or this sculpt stroke, didn't really have enough resolution on it. That's why it looks very jagged. I'll just erase it. Now it's important to note that actually all those same techniques I showed you for adjusting the size and strength of the brush applies to all these other tools as well. And there it is, erased. In fact, the erase tool can be a very valuable tool for sculpting. It's not just for, let's say, getting rid of mistakes. You can very intentionally use it as a modeling tool as well. But I should point out that I can only erase on the layer that I'm currently using. So let me turn on one of my other layers and notice that if I don't have that layer selected, I cannot erase it. However, if I select that layer, I can now erase the sculpting that is on that layer. In addition, I'm going to hide this layer and select this one. In addition, with the erase tool here, if I want, instead of using the tool as a brush and erasing, I can also flood the whole layer. Bring the strength up and flood it again, which will get rid of all of the sculpting on that layer. I'm returning to my sculpt layer 4 now. Okay, so I'm back on my sculpt layer 6. I have my sculpt tool reactivated now, and we'll take a look at a couple other settings for your sculpt brushes or sculpt tools. So I can sculpt by using it like a brush like this, and it pulls this geometry out. However, I can also invert this brush. Here, there's the invert function, and if I activate that, instead of pulling the geometry out, I push it in. There's also a hotkey to do that function, so I'm going to turn off the invert function. You can see that my brush pulls the geometry out. If I hold down the Ctrl key on my keyboard, it will push the geometry in. Another tool that we can take a look at quickly is the Smooth tool. I'm going to turn on the Smooth tool, and notice that it smooths out the sculpting when I use it. This isn't the best example. It would be better if I showed you some sculpting where it was a little bit rough, and that this might, help smooth it out and make it look a little nicer, but still, I think you get the idea. What I wanted to show you here is that if I return to my sculpt tool, and I'm just going to mess this up and make this look a little more like something where the smooth tool would work out well. This looks a little messy. I can choose my smooth tool, or I can simply use the sculpt tool and press the Shift key on my keyboard, and that will also work as a smooth brush. We'll take a look at a couple more settings for your sculpt tool here. I'm going to once again hide a layer and create yet another layer, a 5th layer here to show you this. I still have my sculpt tool selected, and what I'm going to do is try out these different fall off selections here. You'll notice them right here under the fall off tab, and you have a number of them here. This is the default. Let's take a look at what that looks like. I'll just make a stroke here like that. You can see that this, or we can look at it here as well, pretty much describes how the brush works. It's the top, the peak of it is very soft. It comes down here, and then where it joins the base, it's also very soft. Let's try a different fall off. We'll try this one here. Once again, I'll create a stroke, and you'll see that this gives us a very different effect here, where the peak here is quite sharp, but it's still very smooth where it joins at the base. If we wanted to do something to contrast with that one, perhaps we could try this fall off here. And that gives us another effect where it's very rounded on the top, but at the base it's very abrupt. In addition to these fall-offs, you can create your own as well, simply by dragging these handles. You can make your own fall-off. Let's see what this one does. You'll notice that when I use this brush, I get this middle area that makes it look a little bit like a donut. And this will be a very good brush to show you yet another feature with these brushes. And that is the stamp spacing, currently set to 2. So if I do a stroke, you'll see I get this effect, which isn't very nice. However, if I increase the distance for the stamp spacing, I'll get this effect. I'm going to make my brush smaller. Can also type in a value. We'll be covering stamp spacing in a later video when we go over stamps. But for now, I think that should be good. There is one other thing I will demonstrate before wrapping up this video, however. I want to talk a little bit more about the strength of the brush before we wrap this up. So let me hide this layer and create yet another layer. I'm going to select my sculpt brush and I'm going to set it back to the default fall off. And maybe I'll make my brush a little bit bigger. I want you to take note of also the strength of this brush. I'll bring the strength down a little. And that should be good. I'm going to start sculpting on this surface. Oh, let me return the stamp spacing back down to a smaller number. Okay. So what I want you to notice is that the strength of the brush, it will peak out at a certain point depending on the strength. So you can see that I get this plateau and it stops going higher. That's because that's the strength I have it set to. Until I release the left mouse button and start painting on the surface again. If I were to increase the strength of this brush, you'll see that it'll max out at a higher strength here. So that should just help maybe clarify a little bit about how the strength of the sculpt tool is working. Now, my recommendation when you initially start working in Mudbox is not to try to create anything in particular, to just experiment and explore with these few tools. There's a lot to cover in here in Mudbox. As you can see, there's a lot of other sculpt tools here, which we'll be looking at later in a later video. But first, I would start mastering these few techniques of navigating in a 3D space, working with layers, and using the sculpt brush along with the different settings that you can create on that brush here on the right side. I hope that this video is useful for you, and thanks for watching.